Okay, we'll make a start because we have 3 talks back to back. This is always one of the most exciting mornings of CCN because it's the time when CCN starts to get interactive. I hope you've all come feeling recharged after last night, and you've also come with your laptops charged, ready for the tutorials that will follow on from these 3 keynotes. And it's also like a really exciting thing from a point of view of the organizers for CCN, because it's a forum for some material to be contributed and keynotes to be contributed to the conference, but are entirely driven from the community itself. And so this year we had 7 fantastic submissions, proposals for Keynotes tutorials. They were very hard to choose between, and following some internal review and ranking by the program committee, we settled upon 3. And so you'll hear a keynote from each of those 3 tutorial teams first, back to back in here, and then they'll parallelize and go into separate rooms, and you'll be able to go and work through the materials associated with those keynote tutorials. So the first keynote tutorial comes from a team led from Johns Hopkins University primarily, and that's going to be Michael Bonner talking about a high-dimensional view of computational neuroscience. So let's welcome Michael.
Looks like I need to be switched over here. Thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. All right, so today we're going to be presenting some work that addresses a very basic question in neuroscience, and that is, how do we understand neural representations? Now, the way that neuroscientists typically approach this question is through representational modeling. So the idea is that we develop a model of the information that we expect to find in the representations, and then we compare this model to brain activity. But in the talk today, I want to take a step back from representational modeling, and I want to consider what I think is a more fundamental question, and that is, what is the nature of the representation itself? In other words, what is the structure of the representation that we're trying to describe? Now, to get at this question, one of the first things that we need to do is we need to understand how many meaningful dimensions are contained in the representation. In other words, how many dimensions do our theories need to account for? And another thing that we need to understand is how universal are these dimensions? Do we see them in every person, in every network? Do we think that they can be explained with a single model that applies to all people? Or are there aspects of the representations that are idiosyncratic? Now, in the talk today, we're going to be discussing work from 2 different groups that addresses these questions of dimensionality and universality in the context of the human visual system and artificial neural networks. All right, so before I get into our findings, I first want to take a little bit of time to talk about why should you care about dimensionality, right? Why is dimensionality an important concept to neuroscientists? And one of the primary reasons that dimensionality is an important concept is that it's a key signature of the computational strategies used by a representational system. And to illustrate this point, I'm just going to go through a few concrete examples here. So one area in which dimensionality has played an important theoretical role is in the study of the motor system. So researchers have found that despite recording from many neurons in motor cortex, the activity patterns are often well described by a relatively small set of latent dimensions. It's been argued that this low dimensionality is actually playing an important computational role in the motor system because it simplifies the complexity of action plans. Right? It essentially reduces the number of variables that need to be independently controlled when developing and generating an action plan. So another area in which dimensionality has played an important theoretical role is in computational models of vision. So it's been argued in vision that the computations that support invariant object recognition are characterized by low dimensionality. They're essentially reducing the irrelevant sort of low-level perceptual variance associated with object representations and thus reducing the dimensionality of object representations. And in doing so, they give rise to the ability to recognize objects across many different settings. All right, now not all theories of dimensionality focus on the benefits of low dimensionality. There are also compelling theoretical benefits to high dimensionality as well. And two of the most important are efficiency and expressivity. So high dimensional representations are efficient in the sense that there's just less redundancy in the neural activity. And so each dimension is conveying something unique that's not already been conveyed by another dimension. And they're expressive in the sense that they're information rich. Right? It means that you can read out lots of different information. You can categorize stimuli in many possible ways. Right? One way that we can think about this is that high dimensional representations are thought to be well suited for tasks or for settings in which we don't know what specific tasks we're going to need to use the representations for. Right? When we have an open-ended set of tasks, we don't know what specific dimensions we're going to need to focus on. All right, so I've been talking about the theoretical properties of dimensionality, but how do neuroscientists actually characterize the dimensionality of neural representations? All right, so the way that this is typically done is by using a method called principal component analysis. And the idea here is that we can take a set of brain responses to, say, stimuli in an experiment. So for example, we can have voxel responses to a bunch of different images, illustrated by the dots here. And we can identify the latent dimensions in the data set, sorted by the variance that they explain in the data, right? Where the first PC accounts for the most variance. Essentially allows us to identify the most important latent dimensions in our data set. And a useful summary plot that we can generate from PCA is called the eigenspectrum. Right? It shows us the variance along each of these latent dimensions. Now, when looking at this eigenspectrum, we can get a sense for how variance is spread across the latent dimensions of the system. And for example, here's, in this toy data that I have here, we can see that almost all of the variance is concentrated on the first principal component. Right? So this is a system that can effectively be reduced to one dimension. Now, the data that I'm going to be presenting today have many thousands of dimensions. So the eigenspectra that we're going to be plotting will look more like this. So they're on a log-log scale. Each dot corresponds to the average variance in a bin of principal components. And what we can determine by looking at these plots is whether the data that we're looking at have low dimensional structure, with almost all of the variance concentrated on a reduced set of latent dimensions, or high dimensional structure in which the variance is spread across many latent dimensions, possibly all of them. Okay, so now let's get into our findings. So I'm going to be telling you about some work that we did to characterize the dimensionality of natural image representations in the human visual system. To do this, we're taking advantage of a data set called the natural scenes data set. It's really a unique data set of large-scale fMRI in human vision. So this is data that has relatively high spatial resolution for MRI, and it has high signal-to-noise ratio. And importantly, it involves fMRI measurements of responses to 10,000 images in each participant. And so this data makes it possible for us to examine eigenspectra spanning multiple orders of magnitude of principal components, and it allows us to examine the dimensionality of human visual representations at a scale that just wasn't possible before. All right, now the data that we're going to be working with, a schematic illustrating this data on the left here. So I have these data matrices of fMRI responses to 10,000 images that were each shown 3 times, and we're going to be looking at approximately 15,000 voxels. Now, there's an important methodological consideration that I want to point out here, which is that if we were to characterize the dimensionality of these representations using standard PCA, the eigenspectrum that we would get would reflect both the thing that we're interested in, which is the stimulus representations, but also any noise that happens to be present in the data. Right? So fMRI data has all kinds of noise. It could be head motion, it could be physiological noise, right? And of course, we're not interested in the dimensionality of the noise. So what we can do is we can use a method called cross-validated PCA. Now, conceptually, what this method does is that it uses cross-validation across stimulus repetitions to isolate the stimulus-dependent variance in the data, the variance is reliably associated with a stimuli, and to remove the contribution of the noise. Right? And one way you could think about this is that when using this method, if the data were completely random, then the expected eigenvalues would be equal to 0. Right? Now, I'm not going to get into the details of this method here beyond this, but if you're interested in it, I encourage you to attend the tutorial later where we're going to discuss this and walk through this step by step. Okay, so what do we see when we apply this method to human brain representations of images? So just to orient you, this is what I'm going to be showing here is a eigenspectrum, cross-validated eigenspectrum on a log-log scale. I'm showing this for a general region of interest spanning really all visually responsive voxels in this data set. I'm showing this large region of interest just for simplicity, because the results that I'm going to show you are representative of what we see all throughout visual cortex, even when we're looking at smaller regions of interest. All right, so what do we find? So what we see is clear evidence for high-dimensional structure in the representations of natural images in the human visual system. We see meaningful variance that's reliable and spread across all latent dimensions. We see no indication of a break or a cutoff in this spectrum, no indication that the data can be reduced to a smaller subset of dimensions that accounts for all the variance. Really seems to be the case that the stimulus-related information is spread across all latent dimensions in visual cortex. And I want to point out that this finding is highly consistent with a previously reported result from mouse visual cortex that was obtained with calcium imaging. Shows a very consistent result with what we find here using the same method applied to a different data set. Right? It suggests that this high-dimensional structure that we're seeing here is a very general property of visual cortex representations that's consistently observed across different mammalian species. All right, so what are these results telling us? They're telling us that the image representations of visual cortex are fundamentally high-dimensional. Right? And this contrasts with other systems in the brain, which are thought to have low-dimensional structure. It suggests that visual cortex uses a different type of representational code, right? One that's highly expressive and that leverages the information coding abilities of all latent dimensions. Another exciting aspect of this finding is that it demonstrates that it's possible to detect this high-dimensional structure in the human brain using fMRI to see signals spanning thousands of latent dimensions. Now, you might have thought that something like this wasn't possible with fMRI, simply because of the core spatial resolution of the data. But what we're seeing here is that when using state-of-the-art neuroimaging methods and having large-scale data, it's possible to detect this kind of high-dimensional latent structure in the data. And I think this is a really exciting thing for cognitive neuroscience because it suggests that we have the right tools that we need to study the human brain in high dimensions. We're not limited by our methods, we're just limited by the scale of our data sets. And that brings me to another interesting property of these results, which is that this eigenspectrum seems to be described by a power law distribution. And the thing that's interesting about a power law distribution is that it's scale-free. It means that there's no preferred level of dimensionality along the scale. There's no point at which we see an upper bound on dimensionality. And it suggests that if we were to continue collecting more data, we would continue to observe more and more latent dimensions. We're only limited here by the scale of the data that we have. All right, I want to take a quick detour here to talk about a related finding from my group, where we examine the eigenspectra of image representations in convolutional neural networks. So what I'm showing here is eigenspectra for a bunch of different convolutional neural network models. Each line is a different neural network. I've color-coded these lines according to their representational similarity to visual cortex. Right? And what you can see here, so the red lines are the ones that are more similar to visual cortex, and the blue lines are less similar to visual cortex. And what you can see is that the models that are most similar to visual cortex are the ones that have the same kind of high-dimensional structure as what we see in the human brain, with power law eigenspectra, dimensionality spread across many latent dimensions, and no clear break in the spectrum. Right? So this suggests that this high-dimensional structure that we're seeing in both the human brain, it's also been reported in mouse visual cortex, is also consistently observed in the best computational models of visual cortex as well. Okay, so getting back to our fMRI data. So when we saw these results, one of the first things that we were wondering is, to what degree are these representations shared across people? Are all the dimensions of this high-dimensional code shared across individuals? And before we ran our analyses, we can imagine multiple possible outcomes here. Right? So one possibility is that maybe there's just a smaller subset of these dimensions that's shared between people. And that's really the subset that we should focus on for understanding vision in general. Right? And then the rest is just sort of idiosyncratic aspects of different brain representations. Right? Or another possibility is that all these latent dimensions are shared across people. Right? And that would suggest that to understand what's happening in human vision, we really need to understand these high-dimensional representations that seem to show up in every person that we study. Okay, again, there's an important methodological detail about how we do this. I'm going to describe it at a very high level here. So we're going to use a method called cross-decomposition. Now, the basic idea is that we want to look at a variance spectrum of the shared dimensions between pairs of individuals. But to do this, we first need to align individuals along their shared latent dimensions. Right, so once we've aligned individuals along their shared latent dimensions, we can then compute the covariance of these dimensions between subjects, and we can do this again in a cross-validated way. Right, and by doing this, we get something that looks a lot like the eigenspectra that I was showing you before, except now it's telling you about the shared dimensionality between a pair of individuals. All right, so as a reminder, here's what we saw before for our within-subject eigenspectra. And here's what we see for our between-subject eigenspectra. Right, so these eigenspectra are remarkably similar to each other. Right? It suggests that the dimensionality that we're observing in each person reflects dimensions that are universally observed across all of the participants in the study. Right, so this is really strong evidence that this high-dimensional structure is really telling us something fundamental about how visual representations are encoded in the human brain. Right, so what this is showing is that these high-dimensional representations of visual cortex are shared across individuals. And I want to point out one other aspect of this finding, which is that you can only really see this shared high-dimensional structure by aligning individuals along their latent dimensions. Right? You couldn't see this if you just put everybody into the same anatomic space and try to compare their brains. It's really in the latent dimensions that you see this. Okay, again, I want to take another quick detour here. I'm going to show you one last result from my lab, which is that this is a project in which we took this idea of looking at shared dimensions and we applied it to convolutional neural network models. And so what we did was we took neural networks trained on a variety of different tasks, and we extracted each of their principal components. And for each of these PCs, we computed a metric that indicates whether this PC shows up in many different neural networks trained on a variety of tasks, or whether it's idiosyncratic to a specific model. And so I'm calling that here the universality index on the x-axis. So if there's a high value on the x-axis, this means that it's a dimension that shows up reliably in many different neural networks. And if it's a low value on the x-axis, it means that it's something that's idiosyncratic. It only shows up in specific networks trained on specific tasks. I also computed another metric for these PCs, which is their similarity to the human brain, right? The representational similarity to brain responses to images. And that's what plotted on the y-axis here. So what we see is when we compare these two metrics to one another, there's a very striking trend in which the dimensions that seem to be universally shared by many different neural networks are also the ones that are most likely to be found in the human brain. Right, so what this is showing us is that representations that are shared by many neural networks trained on a variety of tasks are also the ones that we find in the human brain. It suggests that these are dimensions that are general purpose. They support a variety of different tasks. They seem to be useful for many different neural network models, and they also seem to be useful for biological vision. More big picture, this suggests the possibility that there may be fundamental statistical principles that give rise to universal dimensions of visual representation that are shared across many different artificial systems and also shared with biological vision. Okay, and at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter, who's going to be talking about his work in looking at latent dimensions in neural networks.
Thank you, Mick. So I'd like to ask the following question. How is information encoded in deep neural networks? And I want to present a new viewpoint from the perspective of latent dimensions that we developed with my co-authors, Brice, Gaspard, and Stéphane. So I want to start by caricaturizing neural coding in two different strategies. In the first viewpoint, neurons are selective for a concept or a feature. In that case, there are preferred stimuli that the neurons will respond to. And if we have two neural populations coming from two networks or two brains, we should be able to match the neurons from one brain with the neurons from the other brain. And if we look at the weights of the neurons in feature space, we see clusters. In the second viewpoint, neurons are arbitrary samples from a continuous distribution. In that case, there is no preferred stimuli, and there is no correspondence between the individual neurons. It's more of a global statistical correspondence. And the way we could check that is by recording more and more neurons. And the continuous distribution starts to emerge, and then we can compare the different statistical properties. And this view has gained traction in machine learning in the past 5 years under the name of mean-field limit. And I want to focus on this view today. And especially, I want to talk about its implications for neural representations. So there are several reports that neural representations across subjects and across artificial networks are similar. And I want to show that this is a consequence of having the same population statistics. So let's take two networks, a blue and a purple network. And the stimuli that I'm showing to them here are dots of different sizes and colors. In each network, I have neurons that can respond to a mixture of size and color. And the individual neurons are different, but on a global level, the distributions are the same. Now we can look at the representations computed by these networks. So for each stimulus, I record the activity of all the neurons, and I plot the stimulus here in this plane, whose axes are the activity of the different neurons. So the two representations are obviously different, because the tuning properties of the blue and the purple neurons are different. However, they have the same geometry. That means the angles and the distances between the representations are the same, which corresponds to the similarity or dissimilarity judgments you would make based on the representation. And the reason why is that these similarities judgments, when you compute dot products or square distances, they are sums over neurons. And if you normalize things properly, they become averages. And if there are averages, then the law of large numbers kicks in, and this averages converges to an expected value. So that the distances and the angles, they only depend on the global statistical properties of the neurons, and not on the individual neurons that you have. This in turn implies that the representations share their latent dimensions. Here, there are color and size. And if we look at the representations in this latent space, then we see that they are the same. Basically, the only thing that's changing is the neural encoding. Right? The axis blue and purple that corresponds to the individual neurons that you choose are different, but in the latent space, the representations are the same. So population statistics are interesting because it's these statistics that give rise to the latent dimensions. But you can ask which population statistics should I care about? So the first reflex is to look for the moments of the distribution of the neurons. So the mean, which is usually not very interesting, but the covariance of the neuron weights carries a lot of information. So here I have my neuron population. From the covariance, I can extract the principal components. And here I would see that the neurons are mostly aligned on an axis that is a mixture of size and color. So what do we see when we apply this to CNNs trained on an object recognition task? Here I extracted the neurons from the middle layer, and I'm computing the variance along each PC. And what we see is interesting. It's completely different from when you do this on the representations. On the representation, we see a power law indicative of high-dimensional behavior. Here, we see something that is not a power law. There are two different regimes. In the first regime, there is a decay of the variance that is more exponential. Pay attention here that the x-axis is in linear scale. And then there's a second regime which resembles the variance in random matrices, so the variance that you get at initialization. So this suggests that during training, only the first principal components have been learned. And that the way to check that, we can take the network and project its neurons on the subspace spanned by the first PCs and check if the accuracy is preserved. We see that we don't need that many dimensions here to capture the accuracy of the network, and the number of dimensions you need seems to coincide with the number of dimensions is that first regime. So weights have different dimensionality properties than representations. Even if representations are high-dimensional, it's possible that the weights are low-dimensional. And the picture that emerges when you look at the network this way is that it computes a sequence of reductions and expansions in dimensionality. The reduction comes from the fact that the neurons are in a low-dimensional subspace. So the network only cares about a low-dimensional subspace of the representation. But then there's an expansion because you have many neurons, and in that subspace, they all project the representation on different dimensions, different directions. Now, there is an important point that we have to keep in mind when we think about neural populations in hidden layers, so deep in the network. Here are my two representations again, from the purple and blue networks with the latent dimensions. And I want to look at the neurons in the next layer, so the neurons that are going to analyze these representations. I can extract their weight principal components, and what I could see, for instance, is that these principal components are aligned to the latent dimensions. So here, the next layer mostly is interested about the color dimension, but not so much about the size dimension. Now, if I were to directly compare the weight PCs between the two networks, I would conclude that they are different. But in fact, what we should do is rather look at these in the basis of the latent dimensions, and now I would see that they are the same. So it's an important point that we have to think that hidden neural populations, they are relative to the latent dimensions of the input representation. So let me go back to my original question. How is information encoded in deep neural networks? The answer that I want to give is that it's encoded in the global statistics of neural populations, which may be a bit vague, but sometimes we can give a much more precise answer, which is the only statistic that you need are these weight PCs. And I'm going to show this in the setup of a simplified CNN trained on CF10. And my answer has 2 points. First, the weight PCs are universally learned. So I train 2 different networks on this same task. They have the same architecture, but they are trained from different random initialization. I extract the weight PCs, and I compare them. And what I see, if I compare them in the basis of the latent dimensions, is that the top PCs are aligned, indicating that the 2 networks have learned them. And we know that the top PCs are the ones that are important for performance. Right? At higher rank, there is no similarity, but that's because these are random. They just come from the initialization. Now, the second point is that weight PCs are sufficient to capture the task performance. And how I'm going to check that is I start from a trained network, which reaches 92% accuracy, and now generate a new network with random weights. But the constraint that I put in is that this network shares the weight PCs with the trained network. So I've compressed my parameters to the weight PCs, and just from that, I can generate an infinite family of random networks that all share the same accuracy. So my key takeaways are these ones. Learned information is encoded in the global statistics of neural populations rather than individual neurons. Second, the statistics, they seem to be universally learned, and it implies that the latent dimensions in the representations are also universal. This is a consequence of the more fundamental fact that the neural populations are the same. And finally, the statistics, they can sometimes be reduced to the covariance of the neurons, and it defines a new notion of dimensionality that's different from what you see when you only look at representations. And if you want to have more details, come to our tutorial. Thank you. And I hand it over to Nick.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to say a few more things to wrap up here. So we've shown you some work across both neuroscience and machine learning that points to bigger picture story about what's happening in the representations of the brain and neural networks. We've shown you evidence that the visual representations in the human brain are fundamentally high-dimensional, right? They can't be understood from a low-dimensional perspective. They differ from other systems that appear to rely on low dimensionality, suggest that visual cortex uses an expressive code that's efficient, leverages all of its latent dimensions. And I want to point out an important implication of this, which is I think that for future work, it may be better to pursue simplifying explanations by focusing on underlying generative mechanisms rather than trying to catalog and describe all of the dimensions of human visual representation. We also showed you that to understand these representations in both the brains and neural networks, you really need to focus on the latent dimensions. Right? This information is not obvious when looking at neurons or voxels. It's really in the latent dimensions that you see this. And finally, this is all pointing to some a very exciting big picture idea, which is there may be core statistical principles that give rise to universal dimensions of visual representation in both biological and artificial vision. And we're really excited about the idea of pursuing simple learning algorithms that don't require supervised or self-supervised signals that can discover these universal dimensions. And before I end, I want to thank my students who led these projects and who will be leading the tutorial later, Raj Magesh Gautaman, Atlas Kazamian, and Ray Chen, and my collaborators in these projects, Eric Almaznino and Brice Minar. And thank you all for your attention.
Okay, thanks Mick and Florentin. That was fantastic and fantastically clear. We do have time for some questions here, so if anybody would like to ask a question, please do come to the mics. Go first.
Thanks for the great talk. I was curious how you reconcile your perspective with the low-dimensional manifold that people also discuss in systems neuroscience mainly.
I'm sorry, can you lean into the microphone?
Okay, thanks for your talk. I was curious how you reconcile your perspective with the systems neuroscience work on low-dimensional manifold in the brain.
Yeah, how do we contrast what we're finding with other work showing low dimensionality in brain representations?
They argue that the brain is operating actually in a low dimension.
That what's in low dimension?
They argue that the brain operating in a low dimension.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So there have been lots of reports of low dimensionality in neuroscience in many different systems, and lots of theories about why it's beneficial. There are a few different answers to this. So one is that I think it's dimensionality, the computational demands of different systems may call for different levels of dimensionality. And so that's an interesting question that I think we need to understand that we haven't really worked out yet. But also, I think that we may have tricked ourselves into thinking that dimensionality is low because our experiments are small scale. Right? So everything looks low dimensional when you have a small number of experimental conditions or a small number of stimuli. So I think we're really, we're just entering the age of large scale human neuroscience. And I think that we may see more and more of this high dimensional structure when our data sets scale up. Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah, thanks. That talk was just amazing, wonderfully didactic, and the research is extraordinary. So thank you so much. Yeah. I guess my question really relates to, so you talked about the necessity of ensuring that you're measuring dimensionality in the shared subspace by doing cross-validated PCA. But there's another sense in which we might want to identify a subspace which is relevant, and that's the subspace which is relevant for behavior. And so, I think that it seemed like there was a slight contradiction between the two presentations in which that, in the first presentation, we saw the importance of high-dimensional representations, and the second, we saw that in the learned networks, it's actually the first few principal components that are learned. So my question, I guess, for you, Mick, is if you do the same eigenspectrum analysis on your CNNs over the course of training, does the eigenspectrum still match humans early on in training? In other words, is it really a feature of the architecture of the way the network is trained to solve the task, or is it just an intrinsic property of the architecture? And secondly, if you train in the natural scenes data set, nobody's doing anything, right? They're just sitting there. Mm-hmm. And if the claim that visual cortex is fundamentally high dimensional, I don't think we can make that claim until we know the sensitivity of the dimensionality to the task people are doing. So if you ask people to do a task which requires them to group things together, for example, we might well see that the dimensionality in visual cortex is actually much lower than in the experiments that you described.
Yeah, so this is a really great question, thank you. So, okay, so a few answers to this. So one is that, what we see so far is that the stimulus-related variance in the data, the reliable stimulus-related variance, that's high dimensional. Now, are all of these dimensions relevant to behavior? We don't know yet. This is something that we're developing some experiments now to look into. And how would it change as a function of task? That's also something I'm really interested in. and how does it change as a function of attention? I mean, I think there are lots of ways in which you think this eigenspectrum could be manipulated by task demands. Now, in regards to this, this apparent contradiction between the low dimensionality and the weight PCs of the networks and the high dimensionality we're seeing. So there's a few things here to keep in mind. So one is that the low dimensionality in the weights actually is not evident in the activations of the network. So what we see as like neuroscientists are activations. We don't have access to the statistics of the neuron weights. Those neuron weights, as they get passed through the nonlinearity, get expanded into a high dimensional representation. It's actually important to do this expansion to feed in a high dimensional set of information to the next layer, which then learns a reduced set of representations, and then expands that again and sends it to the next layer. So the low dimensionality is really only evident in this one step of the network that is in the weights. And the other thing is the low dimensionality that he's showing is actually just because is mainly driven by the fact that he's looking at very simplified settings, so like CIFAR 10. And so the dimensionality of solving that task is low. And then as you look at this on larger data sets, the dimensionality that's required for those data sets grows. So it does seem to be the case that as you look at what's needed to solve complex tasks in neural networks, they also call for higher dimensional representations.
I'm going to ask the next speakers to come and set up, and we'll maybe take one final question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. You showed that this spectrum kind of is aligned across participants. My question would be, what would happen if you constrain your image set to different categories? So, for example, faces and text, whatever. So, would this dimensionality show a kink, so to say, if you
Yeah, this is a great question. I love these questions. They're all the things that we're thinking about a lot in the lab and projects that we want to do. So we don't know yet, but it's something we're looking into. I will say that so far, we've seen that the dimensionality trends that we see here are pretty consistent across whatever images we choose to look at. And we haven't specifically looked at like faces versus other things or something like that, where there might be larger distinctions, but it seems to be, anytime you look at natural images, it seems to be a general property of natural image representations across categories. And also I should mention that when we look in category selective regions, like face areas and scene areas and body areas, we see this same high dimensional structure.
Okay, let's thank Mick and Florentin one more time.
Thank you.
So if you'd like to attend the tutorial associated with that keynote, that's going to take place through in the East schools, and the materials associated with that tutorial have just been tweeted out, or X'd out, from the CCN X Twitter account. So please do go and check that out. Our next keynote tutorial team come from Google DeepMind, and our presenters are going to be Maria Eckstein and Kevin Miller, and they're going to talk about contrasting cognitive and deep learning approaches to modeling behavior. So let's welcome them. Thanks.
Hi, thanks so much for having us. So Kevin and I will be giving the lecture, and then Kim will join us for the tutorial later, and for the sake of time, she's not going to be giving part of the lecture. But yeah, what we want to talk about is something that we have all been thinking about for a while, and this is this apparent tension between classic cognitive models and new neural network models, and maybe also how we can resolve some of those tensions, or how we can reconcile those. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to start my talks with these videos here, and ask people, what do both of those videos have in common? And if you want to shout something out, please feel free. People often say things like movement, or color, or play, or learning. And then usually at some point, I don't know if anybody has an idea, at some point somebody says, reinforcement learning. And this is the answer we all want to hear, right? both of those agents are using the same algorithm. The dog is learning using reinforcement learning, and the Satari agent also is learning using reinforcement learning. And the reason we all want to hear this answer is because now, if this dog is using reinforcement learning, we can understand what the dog is doing. We can say things like, this dog is calculating values for its actions. We can say things like, this reward is experiencing reward prediction errors. We can say things like, this dog has a learning rate and maybe an exploration temperature. And so we can have some insight, some understanding of what is going on inside the dog. But the story is more complicated, obviously. What happens if a new model comes along that actually explains the data much better than this reinforcement learning model? What do we do? Should we throw out the reinforcement learning model? What if this new model is a black box, like a neural network? What are we going to do about this tension? And this is exactly what our talk is going to be about. So the setup that we usually work in obviously looks more like this. We have a participant who comes to the lab who might be working on a 4-armed bandit task in this example and produce an action on each trial, for example, choosing one of those 4 stimuli and receive a reward. And then with the knowledge of those past actions and rewards, this participant will be able to choose better actions in the future. And of course, how this works is the participant has memory, which I call a cognitive state here, where participants can learn over time which stimuli tend to lead to more points than others. And one popular way of modeling this problem is using classic reinforcement learning, where the value and the reward that I receive lets me calculate a reward prediction error, which I can multiply with the learning rate to update my previous value. And then those values over time guide my action selection. And the reason we all like this model is because we can learn a lot of things. We can learn about cognitive development, say, in the way that Kate told us beautifully in her keynote on the first day, where we can, say, calculate the free parameters for individuals and then see how those parameters change over time. Or we can look at brain function. We can, for example, derive regressors based on the reward prediction error for each trial, or how the values change over trials, and regress that against some brain data. We can think about mental illness and psychiatric symptoms in a similar way, where we either calculate those free parameters and compare them between individuals, or we can do beautiful lesion studies where we knock out one part of the network maybe, or set some other parts to some values and see how we might be able to explain group differences. And there's a whole long list of people that a lot of you all here have worked on, where we can use this kind of classical model to understand those cognitive phenomena. What we usually do as part of this process is we fit our model to the data, and we calculate a model fit that I'm showing here. So lower is better because this is my loss. So this, say, is my model fit to this data. Another modeling choice that we could do is to fit a vanilla neural network to the same data. You see, this network has the same inputs and the same outputs. So again, the job of this network will be to take in past actions and rewards and predict future actions that humans choose. And this neural network will have access to a hidden state in which it can store all kinds of memory, just like any RNN. And the interesting thing to note here is that this model does not incorporate a cognitive hypothesis about what is going on in the mind. It is a universal function approximator that can approximate any function, including the cognitive function that gives rise to behavior in this example. And when we now compare the model fit of those two models, the neural network model usually blows the classic cognitive model out of the water. And this is true across a lot of domains. A lot of people have now found this, that neural networks can really predict human behavior or animal behavior much better than any classical cognitive model. The issue, of course, is that we don't really know what is going on inside this network because we have replaced one black box with another. And of course, there's a lot of people who are working on understanding what is going on inside these networks. But I think we can still agree that there is this tension between a lot of predictive power in those more flexible neural network models versus very good interpretability in those classic cognitive models, because they really explicitly instantiate those cognitive theories that we want to test. So this is kind of this tension that is emerging between having models that fit the data set really well and models that are very interpretable and give us cognitive hypotheses on the other hand. And on one hand, we have those general but black box neural network models, and on the other hand, we have those more constrained but interpretable classic cognitive models like reinforcement learning. And the thing that we want to argue here, basically, is that this tension, this binary choice might not be as binary as we think. And we are hoping that indeed we can kind of orthogonalize those two dimensions, this interpretability and the fit to the data set. And if our two model classes are here occupying the two extremes, we now see that there's a lot of space in between those models where we might be able to find models that are both interpretable and also fit a data set really well. And if we could achieve that, we would inherit all of the benefits that each one of those models has, plus all of the benefits that the classic approach gives us, notably the interpretability, but also the benefits that we get from those new, more powerful, more flexible neural networks, and maybe some other benefits that just arise from the combination, like advantages for theory discovery. And Kevin will tell you more about what approaches have come out in the recent past.
Cool, so we want to create models that live in this goal space up here. And the question is, how are we going to do it? Now that we've got these axes, I want to first lay out some of the traditional approaches. And the first is classic cognitive modeling, which I've done a lot of, and I think a lot of you have done a lot of, and that looks something like this. You can implement your cognitive hypothesis as a runnable model. You're going to take your idea and make it into math or make it into software. And then you're going to run it, and then you're going to see how well it fits the data set, and the first thing isn't going to fit all that well. And then you're going to compare it to data, and you're going to iterate, and you're going to improve. And so this is a process of trying to push it sideways towards that goal. And maybe over the course of your project, this kind of thing is going to happen, and you're going to end up with this model out here. And then at some point, you're going to decide, OK, I'm done. That model is good enough, and I'm going to take that forward and use it to try to understand neural data or use it as my computational cognitive model. And maybe if you're really good at this, if you're better at this than I am, maybe you sometimes get your dot all the way into that box. I don't typically. We can contrast that to the standard machine learning pipeline, like if we were at a machine learning conference, what the bulk of the work would be, and that's all about fit to data set. So you would start by implementing a powerful predictive model where the goal is prediction, and you would put it down here. Maybe you have a little tiny bit of interpretability if you're lucky. Then you compare it to data, and you iterate and improve, and you're going to try different architectures and move your way sideways, and the goal is to find something that fits the data better and better. And I think the machine learning undeniably has been wildly successful at this, making new kinds of architectures, applying it to new kinds of data sets, which is cool from the perspective of thinking about modeling data, but it's not immediately useful for getting into Maria's goal because it's not even trying to, right? It's pushing towards this other goal. And so if we want to use these things in our field, I think we're going to need to do something a little different, a little bit special to use them. And I'm going to talk now about some ways that people in the field have been thinking about it and some ways that we've been thinking about it. The first thing you might try to think about is just benchmarking. So this question in classical cognitive modeling is, when do you stop? Like, is that last orange dot good enough? That's a deep philosophical question, but one answer that many people like to give to it is, I want to stop when the fit is as good as it can be. And then that raises the question, how good can the fit be? And you can use these machine learning models to benchmark it. So you could take your best blue dot, and you could draw that line up, and you could say, OK, this is now my goalpost. And maybe I'll know that I'm not there and decide I'm OK with that. But at least I'll know. Or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll keep pushing until I get there. Another thing that some folks have explored successfully is using this as inspiration for improvement. You can say there's certain subjects or certain conditions or certain trial types where the blue dot does much better than the orange dot. And looking at those and thinking about them can inspire you to keep pushing your orange dots further out. Another thing that you might do with these models is try to interpret them post hoc. So start with a powerful machine learning model, and then do something to it afterwards to try to push it up and get some interpretability out of it. There's a lot of exciting ideas here. One of them is dynamical systems analysis. So you're going to find what are the fixed points, what's the geometry of them, what kind of fixed point is each fixed point, maybe make some diagram like this nice box, and either decide, OK, this thing now is somehow cognitively interpretable, or decide, I've got an inspiration from this box that I can use to make an orange dot. You can also just look at the representational geometry, do PCA on the thing. You may find something like this nice-looking pyramid, and that nice pyramid may also be interpretable to you or inspire a new structured model. And you can also study them behaviorally. Once you've built this thing, you can run it, you can do very careful behavioral probes, and that can help you get insight into what it's doing. So here's a collection of networks that differ parametrically, that are being given a bunch of unrewarded trials in a row, and then one reward trial as a probe, and that's affecting their behavior differently. And that might tell you something about what those networks are doing. If you do enough of that, you could get some insight. Okay, another thing you could do is try to make architectures that optimize directly for something that you think is related to interpretability or constrained in some way to be more interpretable. And that means maybe that looks like having things that live over here and you're trying to push sideways and upwards at the same time. One type of constraint that's been used successfully recently is just make the network really small. Small networks have less going on, they're easier to think about. That's been pretty successful in some applications. You can also use a different category of machine learning tools, which is symbolic regression. You're using genetic algorithms to fit your result is not a neural network, but actually a set of equations. And then you can look at those equations and think about them and maybe understand them. You can also use dimensionality reduction. This has been explored really extensively in analysis of neural data sets, where the idea is you've got maybe something like hundreds of units recorded from the rat hippocampus while it's running around and doing something. And if you apply the right techniques to it, you can discover that inside of those 100 dimensions is some nice low-dimensional manifold. At least sometimes, maybe the thing turns out to be high-dimensional, as we saw in the previous talk. So I'm going to talk in a little more detail now about an approach we've been thinking about in this camp, which is trying to apply disentangling in recurrent neural networks for modeling behavior data specifically. So this approach starts with this insight from disentangling in visual autoencoders. These are vision models which have this kind of magical property that they are regularized in a way that encourages them to learn a small number of latent variables. And these small number of latent variables often turn out to correspond one-to-one to like true generative factors in the data generative process, which is kind of amazing. That's the thing we want our models to do. And the key ingredient that makes them work is the information bottleneck. So this is a connection that imposes a cost on passing information through the network. So here's a schematic of what that might look like. The bottleneck has got an input, and then the output is a noisy sample which is based on that input, and there's a cost associated with the amount of noise in that bottleneck. So if you want to send, you're always going to lose some information as you go. If you want to lose little information, send a lot of information through, you have to pay a large cost. If you can afford to spend little, if you don't need that information, you can make the bottleneck closed, you can send little information and pay a low cost. And what this lets it do is prune a connection entirely. Like if this variable z is not actually doing anything useful for the network, this bottleneck can choose to just shut off all the information about that and remove that connection. So we've built these things into a recurrent neural network type of an architecture. We have a bunch of latent variable z. These are the cognitive variables. They go into a choice neural network, which is going to produce an output, which is going to try to match a target. So this y is going to be like your behavioral data that you're trying to fit, and these latent z are trying to be useful to do it. And they're going to have to pass through a couple of bottlenecks in order to make that happen. And these bottlenecks are going to penalize any latents that aren't useful. If you're not helping to predict the behavior data set, you're going to get turned off. And these bottlenecks are penalizing the updates. So if latent z doesn't actually need to see latent z2 in order to learn its update rule, that connection can be turned off. And together, these are going to encourage the system to learn a hopefully simple, interpretable, disentangled solution. I'm going to show you now a couple examples of fitting this to different data sets. The first is a synthetic data set from a reinforcement learning agent that does actor-critic. So here's an example trial, horizontal example session. The horizontal axis is time within the session. There are left choices that are rewarded or unrewarded, right choices rewarded and unrewarded. The actor-critic agent happens to have two latent variables, a v variable tracking the value, and a theta variable, which is its policy. We can understand the actor-critic agent by plotting its update rules. For example, the value goes up when it gets rewarded, unless it's already 1, in which case it stays the same. It goes down if it doesn't get rewarded, unless it's already 0, in which case it stays the same. And there's a policy update which says things like, if I go left and get rewarded, my policy variable should go up, and it should go up the most if I didn't expect a reward, if v was low, and so on. We can plot these update rules as a way of interpreting our synthetic data set's generative process. We fit the disentangled RNN, and something cool happens. It recapitulates this structure. So it's got, the one that we fit has got access to 5 variables if it wants them, but it's choosing to turn off 3 of them, because 3 of them are not useful. And the 2 that it keeps around seem like they're mirroring the time course of the variables in the actor-critic agent. The way it's structured also lets us plot its update rules, and they look pretty similar to the ones that are in the actor-critic agent. So at least in this synthetic example, it's done the thing beta VE does, which is have latent variables that map one-to-one onto the true generative variables. We've also tried this on some real data sets. So this one's fit to a data set from rats doing the two-arm bandit task in the lab. It recovers also a two-dimensional solution. I won't drag you through the details of it, but if I did, I hope at the end of that you would agree that there's an interpretable thing going on here, which is something like this one's tracking the relative value of the two actions, and this one is tracking a long, slow habit variable. A cool thing is the architecture is general, so I fit the same thing to rat data sets from an evidence accumulation task. Here the rat's listening to clicks on the left and clicks on the right, has to decide which side had more clicks. This is an example trial now. This is time within the trial. These are the left and right clicks, and it's again learned a two-dimensional solution where the green one is counting clicks, and the blue one is keeping track of something the rats do, which is click suppression. If clicks come close together, you can't hear the second one, and that's got some time constant to it, and that blue latent has learned that. We can plot its update rules, and again, if we talk through these in detail, I hope you'd agree that the description I just gave is fair. So I'm excited about this tool. I think there's this and other tools like it, I think, can have lots of cool applications. Coming back to the plot of different things you might try, another thing you might try, which I think is also really exciting, is hybridizing these models, taking your classic cognitive model and replacing bits of it with a neural network. So that might look like this. They look cognitive on the outside, but they've got neural networks on the inside. I think this is cool because you can now build things that say, I think A causes B causes choice, and C causes D causes choice, where A, B, C, and D are interpretable, specified by you cognitive things, but the relationships between them are allowed to be flexible and fit in a way that you don't have to decide ahead of time. This has been applied in a really beautiful paper from Tom Griffith's lab to prospect theory. And we've been thinking about it a lot recently in the context of reinforcement learning, and Maria's going to tell you more about that now.
So what we did here is, I'll bring you back to this slide from earlier, where we have this tension between the cognitive model and the neural network, and this big discrepancy in how well they fit our behavioral data. And what we can do using this approach is we can ask questions like, why is RL having a smaller model fit or a worse model fit than this vanilla RNN? Which exact cognitive processes is the RL model missing that the RNN might be picking up on? And which assumptions that RL might be making implicitly or explicitly might not be present in the human behavior? And the way we do this is we collected a relatively big online data set on this 4-arm bandit task. And then we started with our classic cognitive models. And the first thing we did is we set up a neural network model that has the same structure, so the same inputs and the same outputs, but it now replaces the crucial function within this network, the value update, with an MLP that will be fitted to the data. So now instead of fitting, say, one learning rate to human participants, we fit all of the weights of this MLP in order to figure out what the update rule will look like. So just to visualize this a little better, is we can plot the update rule of this classic RL update like this. We have the old values on the x-axis, and we have the new values on the y-axis. And you see that if you get a big reward, your values tend to go up. If you have a small reward, your values tend to go down. And all those lines are nicely parallel. We can now also plot this function in this fitted network in the same way, because it is just an input-output relationship, and see what that looks like. And you see that some of those, there are some similarities between those two plots, like the yellow lines tend to be on top. But also there are some interesting differences. For example, we have differences in the slopes of those lines. Some of those lines are very steep, which basically means that there's a very small learning rate. You pretty much ignore what the previous value was and just listen to what reward you have gotten in the previous trial. And there's also some lines, like the middle ones here, that are very flat, which basically means that you have a very large learning rate. You pretty much stick with your old value and you don't update it much based on the reward. And so the reason this is nice is that this update seems to depend on both the old value as well as the reward that you have obtained in order to calculate the new value. And this is a theory that would be very hard to write down an equation in terms of a classical model. But this is something that we can discover in a data-driven way using this approach. When we look at the fit of those models and see, do we get better? Do we get closer to our goalpost here? We indeed increase the model fit. And what this suggests is that human learning might be different from what pure RL suggests. However, you see that there's still a pretty big gap between this particular neural network and our goal. So what we can do now is we can go through a range of other assumptions that RL is making and test each one of them kind of in the same way. So something that we've been thinking about are reward-independent processes. For example, there's so much evidence that a lot of choice is not actually based on the previous reward outcomes, but it's just autocorrelative. It's just based on the previous choice. For example, perseverance. So in the same way that we started with an RL model and then replace it with this first neural network, we could also set up a model that encodes perseverance the way we usually would code it up, and then replace that same thing with a neural network, and then hybridize our model, so attach both of those mechanisms together in the same way that we would append a perseverance mechanism to an RL model, say, and then see what happens to our model fit. And so in this case, our model fit gets much better, suggesting that those reward-independent processes really soak up a lot of the variance. There really is a lot of those actions in this human data set. Another thing that we can look at is the sensitivity to context. So there's a lot of research now showing that the way you attach value to a certain outcome really depends on the values of all the other outcomes that you have available. Are they much bigger? Are they much smaller? Is the spread big or small between those? And the way we can integrate that into our model is by saying all the models so far basically have an input, they go through neural network, and they have an output. But what we could do is we could take this output, say all the values of all the actions that I have available, and feed that back as an input to the model in order to give it the opportunity to learn about those context-dependent value updates. And this is exactly what we did next. So now the inputs of both of those model components go back as an input to the model. And what we see is that, again, we have a huge leap in model fit, basically saying that this context-dependent updates are very crucial to explain the human behavior. The next thing that we can look up is memory. So there's a lot of research now stating that behavior in those kinds of bandit tasks is not just based on RL, but we also use episodic memory, we also use working memory, we also use long-term memory. And the way to test that in this framework is we can just turn those more MLP-ish architectures into a proper RNN by giving it access to the hidden state of the previous trial. And what this looks like is this architecture here. And when we do that, our model fit goes down a lot. We have almost reached our goal here. And basically what this says is that memory processes are really crucial for this kind of behavior in these tasks. And the reason this is really interesting is because this is something that would be really hard to code up in a handwritten model, because we would have to really specify how does episodic memory work, how does working memory work, and how do all of those different memory systems come together in order to produce behavior. But in this network, we can test it at a more abstract level and then go into the model, kind of in the way I showed you in the previous slide, to understand what each of those components are doing. And the last thing we did here is we added a little forgetting parameter that I'm sorry is hard to see, and this really got the model fit to exactly the level of our goalpost model here. And then one thing that I'll leave as a food for thought is we played around a little more with this model and realized that we don't even need the value here as an input. And I think this is an interesting example of theory discovery, where we can say, what does it even mean for a reinforcement learning to not have a value? So it seems like we can really start thinking about those components, those assumptions of RL in a different way. And if you want to learn more about this model or about the model that Kevin has told about, this is exactly what we will in the tutorial as well.
So just to wrap up briefly, what have we told you about today? We talked about quantitative models of behavior, which I think are a key tool for many parts of computational and cognitive neuroscience. Talked about the goal of building models that both are interpretable in the sense of they express a scientifically useful hypothesis about how the brain or the mind might work, but also produce a good match to the behavior data. Those are both things the models ought to do. Talked about a number of different approaches you might take to get there, the classic approach, which many of us have done, the generic machine learning approach, which you might apply afterwards post hoc interpretability to, interpretability encouraging architectures, hybrid models that combine different elements of the different worlds. I hope we've convinced you that there's like lots of exciting stuff to be done in this space. I think the most exciting things are probably not yet invented and maybe will be invented soon. If we have convinced you that this is exciting, please join us this afternoon for the hands-on tutorial. We'll give you some synthetic data, we'll give you some real data, we'll set you up to try some classic models, some generic RNNs, the disentangled RNNs, the hybrid RNNs. There'll be a lot of time to play and explore that stuff. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. If you do want to do that, there's code on Kim's GitHub. There'll be a QR code soon. We're hoping that if you get set up, okay, here's your thing. If you get set up with that ahead of time, then you won't have to deal with possibly slow Wi-Fi as everybody tries to get set up with it at the same time at the start of the tutorial. So if that sounds good to you, then do that, sometime between now and then. We want to wrap up by thanking our amazing co-authors and also the amazing field that has put us in this exciting place. Where is the QR code? Thanks to all of you. I'll bring the QR code in a second.
Okay, thanks, Kevin and Maria. That was beautiful. And if you can't find the QR code, the link to the GitHub repository is, again, on Twitter. So please do go ahead and download that material in advance of the tutorial so that we don't face Wi-Fi issues. We have time for a few questions. Layla.
Thank you. That was a great talk, and I loved the approach. If the answer to this question is too technical, feel free to punt it to the tutorial. But I think a key part of the disentangled VAEs, the interpretability generating part, is the KL divergence, or something that encourages dissimilarity between the latent dimensions. Mm-hmm. Is there a version of that in the disentangled RNN, or a component like that? That's important to the interpretability, or
Yeah, I can give a brief answer now and a more technical answer later. The answer is yes, the bottlenecks work in kind of the same way. The divergence is between the, oh man, maybe I should give the detailed answer later.
Okay, that's fine.
The bottlenecks work in a very similar way. There is a KL divergence between a sampling distribution and a reference distribution. Okay. You can think of them as working in the same way.
Okay.
But you can also think of them as not working the same way. The VAE allows like these two interpretations, and this thing now like commits you to one of them.
Okay.
Because it's not an autoencoder and it's not really variational, but it's using a bottleneck of the same kind.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really, really cool work. I was wondering, one of the cool things about the cognitive modeling is that you can really quantify individual differences with individual parameter estimates. How would that work with these RNNs? Do you fit them at all the subjects at the same time? How does this work, more or less?
We have thought a lot about this question, and I haven't actually gotten around to trying those things, but I think there's a lot of different ways. And one of those is when you think about the last architecture that uses the hidden state will encode both the past history and also individual differences. So something you could imagine doing is to dimensionality reduce this hidden state, which is a thing I've actually done, and I've looked at different updates in different states, and those states seem to be meaningful, so people go through different states as they learn this task and have different update accordingly. But you could also imagine representing people in this space somehow. So you might have some people who occupy more of this hidden space and some people who occupy more of that hidden space, and you can try to get at individual differences that way, maybe correlate those with your variables of interest. There also are other approaches. Amir Daswali has done something really elegant in this space where basically he pushes the subject identity through an encoder that breaks it down to, say, 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions, and where you lie in this space will inform the later network activities, and then that way you can also force your network to tell you about individual differences. And he used that in a clinical setting and was actually able to pull out some of the underlying clinical symptoms just from this clustering in latent space based on his neural network models. So I think there's a lot of opportunities.
Okay, I'll go. Thank you for that talk. That's amazing work. So I understand that what you're doing basically with your approach is that you're avoiding the point where you're making assumption and injecting assumptions into your model, and instead you're doing it in reverse, where you're going inside the model and then looking at variables, right? Which is a great strength. But there's something to be said about the cognitive models specificity, which you have highlighted several times, which is very important, and how good they are explicitly because of that, because you can test your assumption, your theories. But there is the fitness part that always you have to search for. So the one thing that's frequently presents the problems with fitness of cognitive models is the method that you're using to fit them. So if you're going by maximum likelihood, or if you're going by map or Bayesian methods, there's always part of the lack of fitness that comes from the optimization through those methods, maybe more so than the model itself. And the reason that I'm saying this is that I've played with neural nets used to, instead of what you're doing, basically using them as a fitting tool to fit cognitive models, so much like Alex Spengler has done with likelihood approximation networks, except it's a different kind of structure. And that has improved the fit so much for cognitive models. So my question then would be on that kind of continuum that you showed between fitness and I forget what the term you used for the other end of the continuum. Where would that fall? Where you would be using RNNs, but basically as a tool to fit models instead of how you presented using them in this project.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things there. The first one about like discovery versus building in structure, I think is a really interesting one. And I think I'm excited about is it seems like we now have tools to do kinds of both things and hybrid things, like the machine learning plus the disentangled is letting you discover models you didn't know. The classic approach has always let you write down models you do know. The hybrid approach lets you write down models where you know parts of them, but you don't want to commit to knowing other parts. And of course, you can mix these things. You could write down the things you know, fit the things you don't know, and then try to interpret the fits of the things you don't know. The last question about using neural networks to find the parameters of the cognitive models, I'm not sure I have a great answer to, because I'm not sure I totally understand it, but I'd love to talk about it offline. Do you understand it?
I know a little bit about this project. So I think I would put it in one of those bullet points that Kevin had, how those two approaches can come together. And give us maybe interpretability, better fitting for more complex models.
Yeah, because the point that I'm making is that if you're using RNNs that way, you're basically feeding in the parameter sequence, the data sequences, and the outputs are parameter estimates, the actual model parameter estimates. And then what we've seen in our work, at least, is that once you have that kind of approach, that loss that you plot for RL, just alone RL, immediately goes down by quite a bit. So I can't say it comparatively how it would do compared to your method or whatever, because I haven't tested it, but that's, I guess, where I was going with it.
We'll maybe take one final question whilst the next speaker comes and sets up.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. A question actually builds upon the question that was just asked, so that will save us a lot of time. One classic sanity check that you would use when you're using classic reinforcement learning cognitive modeling is simulation. And these very simple models that algorithmically are almost trivial compared to neural networks are really good at simulating. So my question, and I promise I ask this in a very good spirit, is it worth the travel? If we already have a cognitive model that is very interpretable and that simulates data very well, do we really want to go over the extra trouble of having to use all this insane amount of computational power to just improve the fit if we have already achieved the goal of correctly simulating data with the cognitive model?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it depends on your model. If you have a model that fits your data perfectly well, I think there's no reason to improve it. And I also think that in a lot of tasks, we are not there yet. So one thing that I saw, for example, is that when I collected a data set of 32 participants, my RL model was performing relatively good compared. Did this just turn up? Hello? Okay, so the RL model is performing pretty good in terms of model fit, and also, as you say, in terms of simulating artificial data. And that relates back to a lot of previous talks, actually. once I collected a bigger data set where I have, I think, 3,000 instantiations of this task, all of a sudden I see so much patterns that before I thought were just noise, but that are actually structured behavior. And those patterns my model cannot capture. And I think there's other situations as well, like we're coming out from Wei Ji Ma's lab with the 4-in-a-row task, where a simple model just doesn't capture a lot of things. So I think once the tasks get more complex and our data sets get bigger so we can see more structure, I think this is when the need arises to think about more complex models, really.
Okay, let's thank Kevin and Maria again. So if you want to attend the tutorial associated with that keynote, that's going to take place here in this room after our final keynote tutorial and the coffee break. This is a team from Dartmouth College, led by Caroline Robertson, she's going to be presenting Behind the Eyes, Insights into Cognition from Naturalistic Gaze Behavior in VR. So let's welcome Caroline.
Great. Thank you guys for sticking around. Today I'm going to tell you about some work from our lab investigating the process of naturalistic scene understanding using eye tracking in immersive VR. In particular, I'm going to give you a taste of some new questions about perceptual experience that open up when we step into an active and immersive visual stance. But I'm going to start with a little bit of motivation. So a fundamental question in human neuroscience is how our memory shapes our perceptual experience. This question is often explored, especially in vision science, with stimuli like Mooney figures, and studies how we might ask how our percept of an image like this, which currently probably just look like 3 amorphous blobs to you at the moment, are shaped by our knowledge of what we're looking at. So now that you've seen these photographs of that fish and camel and alligator, if I take them away, you really can't go back to looking at those blobs in the same way that you had before. Your percept has been altered by your memory. The question is, how is this implemented in the brain? Where does memory meet perception? In my lab, we focus on this question mostly from the perspective of a domain in which it's been relatively unexplored, which is scene perception. And we do this for a couple of reasons. The first is that integrating memory and perception is really at the heart of what we do during naturalistic visual experience. Our experience of visual scenes is deeply contextualized by our memory and knowledge of the surrounding environment. So looking at the scene of High Street outside, it's probably hard for you not to feel right now the presence of the examination schools over your shoulder. But memory is also crucial to the activity of naturalistic perception. This is because the scene that is within our current field of view is only ever a subset of our broader panoramic environment. And in fact, it extends further than that, all the way around us, 360 degrees, as we actively explore this environment through head turns and body movements, constantly making choices about what information we will encode and what to ignore, and facing real-world bandwidth limitations on our moment-to-moment awareness. In this sense, scene perception is really a beautiful testbed for understanding how we construct our perceptual experience. In my lab, we've been using immersive VR in combination with eye tracking to understand how people represent the world around them from this active and first-person visual stance. Today, I'm going to tell you about a couple of studies that highlight the kinds of questions you can ask about the mind using these tools, with particular focus on some newer work in our lab using computational approaches to model individual differences in gaze behavior in immersive environments. And after my talk, we're going to introduce those of you who choose to come to our tutorial to an open source toolbox that we've recently released to analyze eye tracking data in VR. I hope that some of you will find this useful for running your own experiments in VR soon. Okay, so to start, I'm going to tell you about a study in which we asked how different individuals encode novel immersive environments. In particular, we were interested in the wide individual differences in gaze behavior that start to emerge when people are free to make head movements and eye movements and body movements to understand their environment. This study was led by my grad student, AJ Haskins. Next, I'll tell you about a very quick study in which we use foveated rendering in VR to understand how much of a scene people are actually aware of in a full-field, active visual display. This study was done in collaboration with Michael Cohen at Amherst and my former lab manager, Tommy Botch. Okay, so starting with the first question, how do different individuals encode novel immersive environments? It's often said that gaze is a window into the mind. And what's often meant by this is that when presented with a scene like this, people will immediately start to scan that scene with their eyes, taking in the content, one eye movement at a time, to build up a sense of their environment. Along the way, they'll have to make choices about what information to sample, which to ignore. So if you could develop a model that could predict where, on average, people would choose to look on this image, you could infer a lot about the human mind. A cognitive map of what the brain thinks matters to make sense of our environment. And in fact, many deep nets today are trained to do exactly that. So trained on where people tend to look across a large set of naturalistic images, networks like Deep Gaze can currently predict where a group of people will look on a left-out image with remarkable accuracy. That said, performance drops dramatically when the task is not to predict where a group of people will look on a new image, but instead where a single individual will look. And this is in part because individuals just do different things with their gaze. So let me give you an intuition for what I mean by this. Again, when presented with a scene like this, each person will take a particular trajectory through that semantic landscape of the scene as they build a sense of their environment, probably bringing their own individual knowledge bases and memories and attentional strategies to bear on this process of getting to know where they are. So ultimately, while the spatiotemporal record of what information was sampled by one individual might look something like this, no two individuals are alike. So here's another individual looking at that same scene, and another, and another. Relatively little is known about these individual differences in the eye tracking literature and the consequences that they might have for cognition and memory. This is a question that we've recently taken interest in. Is gaze a window into the individual mind? In other words, do individual differences in gaze behavior have a story to tell about what different priors and traits shape how people experience their visual environment? So our hypothesis here is that there are, in fact, differences in how people look at scenes that reflect their endogenous cognitive priorities. If true, this hypothesis would lead to a few predictions. The first is that we would be able to use these individual differences that emerge during gaze behavior to individuate people. The second is that if this individuation is in fact a stable property of the person, it should be stable across novel scenes as well as across time, so testing days in our study. Finally, if it reflects conceptual endogenous properties of an individual, it should be something that we could model with a model that knows about conceptual knowledge. What I mean by this is that the model that might be best able to account for individual differences in gaze behavior might not be a visual model at all, but rather large language models. This might seem counterintuitive at first because these models are not trained on the visual features of a scene. In fact, they've never seen a visual image before. Instead, they're trained on how different units of knowledge, words, co-occur in human language. In this sense, they are thought to construct a conceptual level feature space that goes beyond the visual properties of objects that are captured by vision models. So in this feature space, as a quick example, two objects that don't necessarily share visual information. So for example, this person's face and this ball, which look very different to a vision model, could both relate to an abstract concept like Premier League or team, especially if you're familiar with the show Ted Lasso, where this man is the coach of a UK football team. If we could model an individual's gaze and their differences with a feature space like this, that would be strong support for our hypothesis that these differences in part reflect endogenous conceptual priorities. So this is what we set out to do in this study. We had 60 participants, each explore 100 real-world scenes in immersive VR. 29 of them came back for a second testing day about a week later for a reliability session. And on each trial, the people are simply instructed just to look around these environments naturally, just like they were there in real life. They've been dropped into this world, they'll be there for 16 seconds, they're asked to build a sense of their environment. On each trial, they're put inside of a photosphere of a real-world environment. These are just complex scenes that are rich in semantic content. They contain objects and people, scenery, they're indoor and outdoor. Now, in order to get the visual information from each of those scenes into a language model, we devised this approach. We took each of those 360-degree photospheres and first broke each photosphere into smaller image tiles, so 300 per image. Each of those image tiles is going to be described by a person on MTurk who's tasked with describing the content of those tiles. So for this tile here, a rater wrote, "This is a person that is holding a phone and could be texting." For another tile here, this is a man that's holding a camera, could be taking pictures. And here, we have writing that is on a curb. It could be where someone signed that mural. So to describe each tile, a rater was just asked to label what was in the tile, and the second blank to report what it is doing in the context of the broader scene that the rater can see. And third, to generate an inference about what broader purpose that object or text or person could be serving in the scene scenario. Ultimately, we'll have 300 locations in each photosphere described, each by 5 raters. And once we've collected these descriptions for each tile in a photosphere, what we're going to do is transform that sentence into the semantic embedding using a computational language model. So in this case, we're just using an off-the-shelf version of BERT. And so for every scene, what we ultimately have is a characterization of how every location in that scene relates to every other in this conceptual feature space of the language model. Okay, so finally, with this feature space created for us by the MTurkers, now we're going to go back to our eye tracking data. We can now relate this conceptual feature space to the gaze data from the participants in our study. And to do this, we'll simply use a regression to learn a set of weights, the set of weights that best relates an individual's gaze on a scene to this conceptual feature space. So for each person, we'll ultimately have a set of beta weights that describe which conceptual features they prioritize when allocating their gaze on real-world scenes. We're going to call this, in the talk, their individual gaze model. And we'll use these beta weights to try to individuate our participants. Okay, so turning to the first question, are gaze patterns individuating? We're going to address this with 2 complementary analyses. First, we'll test whether the conceptual model that we've built for each participant's gaze from n-1 scenes can accurately predict where they'll look on a left-out scene more than other people. Then we'll use a classification approach to see whether each person's beta weights from n-1 scenes, again, can be used to classify who they are as compared with other people in this experiment. So starting with the results from the encoding-based analysis, I'll show you these on the left plot to start. The y-axis here is going to be the degree to which a person's model can predict where they'll look now on a left-out scene. And what I'm going to plot here is that data against how well that individual specific model can predict where other people will look in that scene. As you can see, this individuation works really nicely. For the vast majority of people, we could use the gaze model that's built from this feature space of BERT to predict where a person would look on a new scene with entirely new content. Again, this is pretty surprising because the beta weights that we're using for this analysis here come from learning a mapping between gaze behavior and the feature space of a language model, a model that has never seen a visual image before. Okay, what I'll show you next is this model's ability to classify individuals. So on the y-axis, I'm going to plot our ability to do just a binary classification of who each person is compared to every other in the study based on the average beta weights from their models. So specifically, we're training an SVM here just to learn who a person is from all scenes except for one, and then classify who they are in a left-out scene. Again, this works nicely. The feature space of a language model seems to contain individuating information about how participants will allocate their gaze in a new real-world environment. Okay, so this is a pretty interesting effect, but next what we wanted to know is whether it was stable. So to test for stability, we ran a couple of other analyses. We first just ran a split half analysis of each participant's gaze model from that testing day, and then tested whether those two halves could individuate the person. So if a person's gaze model is stable, the two models built from those even-odd splits of their data should be highly correlated with each other, which is what we see. But if they're individuating, those even-odd splits should be more correlated with each other than with the odd splits from other people in the study, which is again what we see. But does this stability persist across days? To ask that question, next we tested whether we could use this model that we had built on a participant's gaze behavior from day one, that first testing day, to individuate them based on their gaze behavior on a new set of scenes a week later. This also works. So accuracy here has dropped compared with our ability to individuate within a session, but it's still strong. Together, these results show that individual differences are tracking relatively stable properties of an individual, which persist across at least a week. But what exactly is letting BERT make these predictions? Again, our hypothesis is that the conceptual feature space of BERT might be important for mimicking an endogenous priority map that an individual brings to bear on encoding their environment. But in principle, reliable individual differences could also be based on much simpler things. So starting with a very simple idea, a participant might have individuating motor biases that are consistent across trials. For example, they might have a tendency to look up in a scene or always scan the left side of an image, always scan along the equator. Indeed, if we build a model based on just the XY coordinates of a participant's gaze across this experiment alone, and try to classify who they are based on what I'll then call this spatial model. This model is ignorant of image content of any kind, just based on spatial coordinates. We can succeed in classifying people above chance. So this tells us that there are individuating differences in motor behavior alone. But importantly, BERT's classification beats these spatial models of individual behavior. And combined models, including both of those spaces, suggest that BERT and motor explain different variants. Another important kind of feature space to consider here, though, is the space of a vision model, like VGG. So what I'm going to show you next is a model that's built on the top layer of VGG. In principle, you can imagine that VGG should be able to succeed at a task like this because it knows about the visual objects in a scene. And people might have individual differences and preferences for objects like looking at faces or cars, etc. And interestingly, although we can, again, classify individuals using VGG, it doesn't do better than that spatial model. In fact, when we built a combined model of both of those feature spaces, VGG barely explains any more variance beyond what the spatial model can do. So these results suggest that although there are many sources of individual differences in gaze behavior, including motor biases, there are real gains to be had from modeling individual differences in the conceptual feature space of a language model, suggesting that individual differences in gaze reflect, at least in part, the conceptual knowledge that people bring to bear while encoding their environment. I'm going to show you one last result here that complements this point. So if our ability to individuate people using that language model, in fact, is benefiting from the conceptual level feature space that BERT has, it should also benefit from knowing increasingly more conceptual level information about scene content. We can test this by simply truncating those sentences that I told you each M-trigger has given us for each location in our scene. And we can give BERT either only the first section of that sentence, which is effectively just a label, just this is text, this is a face, etc., or the whole scene, the second section as well, now including the context that people are reporting around that label, or the whole sentence, now including the inference that people make about what that label could signify or be used for in the scene scenario. I'm going to plot next our ability to classify individuals on the right at each of those 3 tiers of information. As you can see, individuation really benefits from gaze models that are built from BERT's full embeddings. So as you can see, individuation here is highest at the last point, where individual gaze models are built from those semantic embeddings of the full sentence, the context-informed sentence, and thus most contextually informed. So taken together, I've told you that differences in gaze behavior can individuate people. They're stable across testing days, and they can be captured in the feature space of a language model. We think that these results provide strong support for our hypothesis that there are stable individual differences in how people allocate their attention in real-world scenes, which reflect in part endogenous conceptual priorities. All in all, these findings suggest that eye movements provide a window into an individual mind, lacing a real-world environment with an attentional fingerprint that reflects an individual's conceptual priorities. Moving forward, we hope that this window might provide insight into the individual differences in cognition that shape how each of us perceive our immersive visual world. So in the few minutes that I have left, I'm going to end with a very short study on a different topic. In this study, we used eye tracking in VR to ask a fun question about naturalistic visual experience, which has to do with what people are aware of in full-field immersive displays. Expanding vision science to displays that are as wide as 100 visual degrees, as we have access to with these immersive headsets, opens many questions about awareness across the visual field, but especially in the wide and the far periphery. In the study that I'm going to end with, we asked a very simple question about perception in the periphery, which is how much color are people aware of in their visual environment during active naturalistic perception? So I'm going to walk you through the study using a video. So in this experiment, participants explored new 360-degree visual environments. These are video environments in a head-mounted display like this. This is an old-school wired headset there. And here's an example of what one of the participants in our lab was looking at as they were exploring one of these environments on a trial. As you can see, while they're observing the environment, we're eye tracking them to keep track of where their central gaze was at all times. Our interest in this study was in understanding how much visual content they were aware of, especially in their periphery, as they engaged in this active visual stance. So to test this question, about 7 seconds into the trial, we changed the visual world that was rendered as a function of where they were looking at. So specifically, we slowly removed color in their visual periphery using gaze contingent rendering so that we could measure the spatial point at which a person could first notice the absence of color in their periphery. So here's an example of what this would look like on a trial. This is now a real screen recording from a participant looking around on one of these immersive environments. You can see these are dynamic environments. They also have audio. And about at this point, you can probably start to tell that only the central part of that person's visual field is in color, and the rest of their periphery is desaturated. In this example, it's about the central third of the participant's visual field that's left in color by the end of the trial. And again, this is a real trial in which a participant did not notice this effect. In fact, when we ran 160 undergrads at Dartmouth on this experiment, all of whom explored a scene just like this in an intentional blindness paradigm, 80% of them did not notice when the vast majority of their visual world was rendered in black and white. In this condition, it was only the central 32 degrees of the visual field that was left in color at the end of the trial, and the rest is desaturated. We moved that annulus size down and to smaller and smaller portions as the experiment went on. So for the sake of time, I'm going to show you just the smallest condition from the study next. Again, I'm going to give you a screen recording first from a real participant's trial on this experiment. So here we ultimately remove color from all but the central 10 degrees of their visual field, can see they're looking around this environment. And by the end of it here, the amount of their visual field that's left in color occupies about the amount of space that a face is going to take up in this scene. So from this perspective here, the amount of visual field that's left in color corresponds to about the size of your palm if your arm is stretched out in front of you. And again, this is an example of a trial in which a participant did not notice this effect. And neither did 30% of the subjects in our study. And of course, between these two conditions, this effect scales with annulus size here. So just to hit this home, when less than 5% of the visual display was presented in color, a third of participants failed to notice this desaturated periphery, or about this much of your visual field. Okay, so this inattentional blindness paradigm is satisfying because it allows us to measure the spatial limits of peripheral awareness in pretty naturalistic conditions. Nobody has a task here. They're just looking around the scene, unsuspecting that anything is about to take place. But what would happen if people were aware of this effect and instructed to actively look for it? Would they still experience these bandwidth limitations on peripheral awareness, just by virtue of being in an active visual stance in this full field display? So in the final study that I'm going to show you, we asked this question, and I'll tell you that the answer is basically yes. So here in this paradigm, we asked participants to widely distribute their attention into the periphery before the experiment began, and to actively look for desaturations in the periphery. We showed them what the effect would look like before the experiment started. They were put inside of the headset. They were shown a desaturated periphery. They were told this is going to happen on a third of the trials that they would experiment and experience, and simply to click a button when they noticed the desaturation in the periphery. Overall, we found that participants reliably failed to detect desaturations in their periphery beyond about 37.5 degrees visual angle, which is certainly wider than that 50% hit rate that I showed you in the first experiment, but it's still pretty compelling. Interestingly, there was also a large amount of individual variability in these detection thresholds, with some participants noticing the absence of color, not noticing the absence of color, beyond a spatial limit of 16 visual degrees, and others managing to detect almost every single trial in which desaturation was in their periphery. And then there are many thresholds spanning between these two ends. Finally, for a subset of our participants, we were able to get them back into the lab for a second day. And it looked like these thresholds were highly reliable across their testing days, suggesting that they might reflect stable individual differences, could have important consequences for how different individuals experience their perceptual world. So there are a bunch of other little results in this paper if you're interested in learning more, but as a final note, I'll say that we don't think these limits on peripheral awareness are specific to color. Rather, our ongoing work suggests that they generalize to other manipulations of the scene content. So, for example, if we were to metamorize the peripheral visual content as a function of gaze, we see very similar effects, suggesting that the bandwidth limitations on perceptual awareness that we're seeing most likely represent more domain-general limitations on the spatial extent of visual awareness during an active visual stance. So zooming out, I've told you today that scene understanding is an active process, and I've introduced you to two studies that expose surprising individual differences in gaze behavior and awareness that characterize this process. Moving forward, there are many, many open questions to explore using eye tracking in VR, including what consequences these individual differences might have for cognition and memory. How do different people ultimately arrive at having common understandings of perceptual experience, given these vast differences in encoding strategies of visual information? And how do the bandwidth limitations posed by wide field active vision shape our visual awareness? Finally, there are hopefully many questions you guys might have and decide to ask with a toolbox that we're going to introduce you to in today's tutorial. So I will end now by just thanking you for listening and thanking my lab, and especially thanking the individuals who drove the work that I just presented today, AJ, Tommy, and Michael.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Caroline. If you want to attend that tutorial associated with this keynote, that will be taking place in rooms 14 and 15 downstairs. And just to remind you, if that choice isn't hard enough, there'll also be another hackathon associated with the Algonauts, which took place yesterday, which will be taking place down in room 6. But we have time for some questions here, so we'll go to that microphone first.
VR is really a good paradigm to study gaze. My question is, from your studies, it looks like individual differences in gaze are more modulated by top-down attention rather than bottom-up features, which is elucidated by your models using BERT. I have two questions about your methodology. One is you used, for vision, you used VGG, just top layer. Have you considered using bottom-up features to more understand that? And second, BERT is relatively highly advanced language model, whereas VEG is pretty archaic. So maybe Vision Transformer would be a more accurate comparison between semantic and...
Yeah, those are great questions, thanks. So to the point of the argument that we're making seems to sort of argue that the individual differences in gaze behavior are mostly accounted for by top-down attention. I would say I wouldn't necessarily go that far. I don't think I've shown you today, as you're pointing out, a fair comparison with a salience model of any kind. And I think, moving forward here, we'd like to look at, for example, earlier layers of VGG as an example to make that point. We have with VGG looked at the top layer and the bottom layer and see very comparable effects, but also, as you're pointing out, moving beyond VGG to another kind of vision model, I think is probably a good next step.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. I really enjoyed your talk, and I think particularly because it really touches on what I think is an intuitive idea, but perhaps an idea that's pragmatically at least difficult for me to envision, which is how we effectively think about the world conceptually influences literally how we see it, and presumably therefore how we experience it. And I'm wondering two questions about that, extensions perhaps of your work. One is presumably therefore, if you can use the large language model to predict gaze, you can use it to predict other things too, that are perhaps outside of vision. And so I'm wondering, for example, you could imagine like how one parses a paragraph of text, whether that's visually or auditorily or various other kinds of cognitive tasks. And I'm wondering if you've tested or tried or thought about any of those kinds of generalizations to explain individual differences in those kinds of tasks. And then the second one is kind of to marry your project with that of the previous tutorial, which is interpretability. Mm-hmm. It's so provocative, this idea that by looking at how I kind of would talk conceptually about something is going to affect how I see it. Can we say something about more generally about how a particular individual conceives of the world on the basis of these kinds of things?
Thank you. Those are really beautiful questions. To the first question, I might need you back here to ask you a question back, if you don't mind. So if I understand correctly, you're asking basically if the same concept would apply across modalities, if these individual differences in visual attention that we can model with a language model, we could also apply the same type of idea to, say, individual differences in auditory attention or in,
yes, and even more specific.
I'm listening to ongoing speech. I think that's a really beautiful idea, and I do think the same kind of approach could be applied in those contexts. We haven't tried yet, but it's very...
And I actually even mean a little bit harder nosed test, which is to take what you've learned in the visual world about an individual and apply that.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. And that would be a stronger argument, a stronger case for the argument that what we're picking up on reflects endogenous priorities, in this case across modalities. Yeah. And then the second question... Interpretability. Yes, we're on top of that right now. So we're very interested in being able to go back into those individual maps that we've built, models that we've built in BERT, and recover information about what these conceptual feature spaces are that are best describing different individuals. We're interested in this in part because we have another data set in which we're looking at gaze behavior in psychiatric conditions and want to be able to recover the types of psychiatric trait correlations with these models that might make them particularly fruitful for understanding different populations.
Thank you.
Take one final brief question.
Thanks. I don't have statistics, but I think when I look at people's gaze pattern when they watch movie, they seem to be more synchronized and less variable than what you
absolutely.
So I wonder if you have any comment about how the size of individual variability depends on the task. Because I think movie is also a big
the task and the stimulus, right? So with a movie, of course, we're all benefiting from very coordinated visual attention through director cuts and a visual field that is moving literally to place our visual attention across individuals in the same location and environment. And then this is completely different in an immersive VR context where each person from the very first head movement they make might take a completely different trajectory. So I think a lot of the kind of questions about individual differences that we're starting to get at, especially in the imaging literature, with movies as a stimulus, just really, it opens a totally different, we're playing a different ball game once we give people the chance to make totally different eye movements in these environments. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, let's thank Caroline again. We now have a coffee break and the tutorial starts at 10:45.